Fate moves in patterns too vast for mortal understanding, weaving threads of connection across centuries with patience that mocks human comprehension of time and consequence. In the shadowed halls of the Draven stronghold, where ancient stones held memories of countless lives lived and lost, such patterns were approaching convergence that would either break cycles of suffering or condemn them to eternal repetition through forces beyond any individual's power to control or comprehend. King Valor Draven ruled the northern territories with authority that had been forged through experiences no living soul could imagine, his dominion maintained through strength that drew from sources deeper than political power or military conquest. To those who served under his protection, he represented absolute authority, tempered by justice, that seemed harsh only to those who had never witnessed the alternatives that weakness invited upon territories insufficiently defended against enemies whose cruelty knew no bounds. But behind the crown that commanded respect from allies and fear from enemies lay secrets that transformed royal strength into personal torment, ancient obligations that made every day a battle between duty to his people and desires that could destroy everything he had spent lifetimes protecting. The curse that bound him to cycles of death and rebirth had taught him that some forms of love were too dangerous to embrace, no matter how deeply they burned within souls that remembered what others had forgotten. Elira Moonfall existed at the margins of a world that had never shown her kindness, her 18 years marked by poverty that made survival itself a daily struggle, and circumstances that provided no protection against those who possessed power to reshape lives according to their convenience rather than consideration for individual welfare. Born into debt that her family could never escape through honest labor, she had learned early that dreams were luxuries that people in her position could not afford to maintain if they hoped to survive realities that cared nothing for personal desires or happiness. The marriage contract that would bind her life to the Lycan kings represented transaction rather than union, obligation rather than opportunity, surrender rather than advancement. To her family, it offered salvation from crushing poverty that threatened everyone's survival. To her, it promised imprisonment in circumstances she could neither understand nor escape through any effort of her own will or capability. Yet beneath the surface of what appeared to be cruel necessity lay currents of destiny that neither bride nor groom comprehended despite being caught in their flow. The shy Omega who trembled at the thought of royal attention carried within her soul memories that had been deliberately suppressed to protect her from truths too dangerous for conscious recognition. The distant king who would claim her through political convenience harbored love that transcended individual lifetimes, while being forbidden expression through cosmic laws that demanded terrible prices for defying fate's designs. Their marriage would begin as most such arrangements did, with resignation, fear, and mutual incomprehension about the forces that had brought them together through circumstances that seemed random, but served purposes ancient beyond human calculation. But as days turned to seasons and proximity forced recognition of connections that neither could explain through rational thought, the careful barriers that separated duty from desire would begin to weaken under pressure of emotions that remembered what minds had forgotten. The curse that had shaped Valor's existence through countless cycles of loss would face its final test through relationship that offered either salvation or damnation, depending upon choices that would determine whether love strong enough to transcend death could finally overcome fate's demand for eternal suffering, as payment for power that had once been claimed through pride rather than earned tea. True wisdom. In chambers where duty had always triumphed over desire, where survival had always required sacrifice of happiness, where strength had always demanded suppression of vulnerability, two souls would discover whether ancient patterns could be broken through courage to risk everything for connection that promised both ultimate fulfillment and complete destruction. The poor Omega would learn that her cruel husband's distance protected rather than rejected her, while the Lycan king would face choice between love that could finally free him from eternal suffering and responsibility that demanded continued existence to protect thousands of lives that depended upon strength that only he possessed through bargains whose prices had never been fully paid, despite CE. Entries of installment payments through systematic heartbreak. Before we begin, remember to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. Every day, a new story awaits you. Now, let us begin. The marriage contract lay on scarred wooden table like death sentence written in formal language that transformed personal catastrophe into legal obligation. its precise terms reducing Elira's future to commodity that could be traded for debt forgiveness and family survival that would otherwise remain forever beyond their reach. The sum involved exceeded anything the Moonfall family could ever hope to repay through generations of honest labor, making the arrangement their only escape from poverty that threatened to claim their lives through starvation that care and determination could not prevent when resources simply did not exist. 20,000 gold pieces, Elder Thorn read, with voice that struggled to maintain neutral tone, while announcing figures that represented more wealth than their entire community had ever seen collectively. Full settlement of outstanding debts, plus additional compensation for inconvenience of immediate arrangement. Elira's father sat with shoulders bowed by weight of decisions that offered survival for his family at cost of daughter's freedom and happiness, his expression carrying guilt that no amount of practical necessity could fully justify, despite obvious lack of alternatives that would preserve everyone's welfare through means that didn't require such sacrifice. The king requires immediate compliance with contract terms, Elder Thorn continued, with administrative precision that emphasized legal obligations over emotional considerations. Departure tomorrow morning, with ceremony to follow upon arrival at royal stronghold according to Lycan customs that will bind union permanently through sacred laws that govern royal marriages. Tomorrow? Elira's mother gasped with voice that carried horror at timeline, that allowed no preparation for transformation that would remove her daughter from everything familiar into circumstances none of them could predict or influence through any appeal to mercy or consideration. Royal commands do not accommodate personal convenience, Elder Thorn replied, with tone that suggested sympathy he was not permitted to express, given responsibilities that required enforcement of agreements, regardless of individual feelings about their necessity or fairness. Contract terms specify immediate transfer of assets to royal custody for purposes that serve kingdom interests rather than family preferences. The euphemism reduced Elira to property being transferred between owners, though she recognized that such perspective accurately reflected legal reality of arrangement that had been negotiated without her participation or consent, about obligations that would define remainder of her existence, according to others' decisions about strategic necessity. What guarantee do we have regarding her treatment and welfare once royal obligations are fulfilled? Her father asked with voice that carried parental concern, despite obvious powerlessness to influence circumstances that had been determined through negotiations conducted far above their social position and economic influence. Royal marriage provides ultimate protection and elevation possible within territorial system, Elder Thorn answered, with diplomatic language that avoided specific commitments about individual happiness, while emphasizing general advantages that royal status provided for those fortunate enough to achieve such elevation through whatever means fate might provide. "That's not what I asked," her father pressed with uncharacteristic assertion of paternal authority, despite circumstances that made such authority meaningless in face of legal contracts that superseded family relationships through royal prerogative that could not be challenged through conventional appeals. Royal household arrangements are internal matter determined by His Majesty, according to customs and preferences that serve kingdom interests rather than external oversight or family interference. Elder Thorn replied with finality that ended discussion about protections that concerned parents could not negotiate or influence through any means available to people in their position. As administrative details continued being clarified through conversation that emphasized obligations rather than rights, procedures rather than protections, Elira found herself observing arrangements for her future with detachment that protected against emotional reactions that would serve no practical purpose while potentially making compliance more difficult than circumstances already demanded. She had known this day would come eventually. Their family's debt had grown beyond any possibility of repayment through normal means, while creditors had become increasingly threatening about consequences of continued default that affected their own obligations to larger financial networks that extended throughout territorial commerce system. Marriage to someone wealthy enough to settle accounts represented their only escape from poverty that would otherwise consume them through systematic destruction of everything they had worked to build. That the wealthy someone proved to be Lycan king, whose reputation emphasized merciless justice and cold efficiency rather than personal kindness or consideration for individual welfare, represented complications she had no power to address through protest or appeal to alternative arrangements that might serve family necessity while preserving more of her personal autonomy and future happiness. "The escort will arrive at dawn," Elder Thorne announced with administrative precision that transformed emotional catastrophe into logistical challenge, requiring systematic attention to detail rather than contemplation of personal implications that would not change practical requirements regardless of individual feelings about their necessity. "What should she bring for royal residence?" her mother asked, with voice that struggled to maintain composure while addressing practical concerns that demanded attention, despite emotional chaos that made rational thinking almost impossible under circumstances that challenged every assumption about family protection and individual security. "Personal belongings of sentimental value only. Royal household provides all necessities according to standards that exceed anything available through private resources, while appropriate attire and accessories will be provided according to royal preferences rather than individual choices that might not align with court expectations." The administrative efficiency that reduced her transition to inventory management emphasized thoroughness of transformation that would separate her from everything familiar while replacing individual preferences with royal requirements that served purposes she could not influence through any expression of personal desires or concerns about compatibility. As discussion continued addressing logistical details while avoiding emotional implications that everyone present understood, but could not afford to dwell upon given necessity of compliance with arrangements that offered no alternatives acceptable to rational consideration of family survival versus individual happiness, Elira began preparing mentally for changes that would reshape her existence, in ways she could not predict or prepare for through any amount of careful planning. The poor Omega, who had learned to survive through careful invisibility and strategic usefulness, would become royal consort, whose visibility would make anonymity impossible, while usefulness would be determined by standards she had never been educated to meet, despite obvious intelligence and practical capabilities that poverty had forced her to develop. "Elira," her father said with voice that carried love and regret in equal measure, as formal arrangements concluded, and time approached for family conversations that would represent final opportunity for personal communication before transformation that would make such intimacy impossible through elevation that created unbridgeable social distance. "We need to speak privately about what marriage means and what you should expect from circumstances that we couldn't prevent, despite wanting different future for you." "I understand, Father," she replied with composure that surprised her, despite emotional turmoil that threatened to overwhelm rational thinking about practical requirements that survival would demand, regardless of personal feelings about justice or fairness of arrangements that had been imposed rather than chosen. "Do you? Because royal marriage involves obligations and expectations that our circumstances never prepared you to understand, while King Valor's reputation suggests that accommodation to his preferences will require significant adaptation to conditions that might challenge everything you've been taught about appropriate behavior and personal boundaries." The careful warning emphasized danger without specifying particular threats, suggesting knowledge about royal character that concerned family members who loved her enough to wish circumstances permitted different arrangements, but lacked power to influence decisions that had been determined through financial necessity rather than personal compatibility or individual preference. "What specific warnings should guide my behavior and expectations about royal household dynamics that could affect my safety and welfare in an environment completely unlike anything I've experienced? Warnings about maintaining respectful distance until you understand his temperament and preferences, about avoiding any action that might be interpreted as challenge to his authority or criticism of his decisions, about remembering that royal marriages serve kingdom interests rather than personal happiness, though personal happiness might develop through successful adaptation to circumstances had initially seemed difficult." The advice emphasized survival through submission, while holding possibility that accommodation might eventually lead to more comfortable relationship, though underlying concern suggested that such comfort was far from guaranteed, given royal reputation that emphasized power over mercy, efficiency over consideration, results over emotional accommodation. And if adaptation proves impossible despite best efforts to serve his expectations and fulfill royal obligations appropriately, then you endure, her father said with voice that carried pain at offering counsel that provided no real hope for escape from circumstances that threatened to crush spirit, along with destroying familiar life. because endurance sometimes leads to improvement when acceptance demonstrates value that initially seems absent, but develops through time and mutual accommodation. The philosophical framework offered slender hope, while acknowledging harsh reality that options would be severely limited once royal obligations began governing daily existence, according to standards that individual preferences could not modify through any appeal to consideration for personal happiness versus royal convenience and kingdom necessity. As night deepened toward dawn, that would bring escort to collect her for journey toward marriage, that represented salvation for family and imprisonment for individual, Elira spent final hours in home that had provided love, despite poverty, security, despite uncertainty, identity, despite social insignificance that had made them vulnerable to circumstances beyond their control or influence. Tomorrow would begin transformation from poor Omega, whose survival depended upon family protection, into royal consort, whose survival would depend upon ability to satisfy expectations and requirements that had never been explained clearly, but whose failure could result in consequences that concerned parents dared not specify, despite obvious worry about daughter's welfare in an environment where Mista Key could prove fatal. The marriage contract had been signed and payment arranged. The legal obligations were clear and binding, but the personal relationship that would develop between 18-year-old Omega, who had never experienced luxury or court politics, and Lycan King, whose power had been earned through methods that emphasized strength over compassion, remained completely unknown, despite being crucial for determining whether obligation could transform into partnership or would remain systematic suffering disguised as elevation. Looking around familiar room that tomorrow would become memory rather than refuge, Elira wondered whether courage alone would prove sufficient for surviving circumstances that offered no retreat, no appeal, and no guarantee that accommodation would eventually lead to anything resembling happiness or personal fulfillment, despite formal elevation that represented pinnacle of social advancement from perspective of those who measured worth through political status rather than individual contentment. The poor Omega was about to discover whether royal marriage represented opportunity or catastrophe disguised as salvation, while cruel Lycan King would face proximity to someone whose presence might awaken memories and desires that had been carefully suppressed through centuries of experience with love that demanded prices too terrible for rational acceptance, despite emotional devastation that sue. Such suppression created in souls that remembered what minds had forgotten. The royal escort arrived with dawn's first light, their presence transforming humble village street into scene of pageantry that emphasized vast difference between Elira's origins and destination that awaited through journey that would separate her permanently from everything familiar. 6 mounted guards in royal livery flanked ornate carriage whose luxury exceeded anything she had imagined possible, while Captain, whose bearing spoke of absolute authority, approached with documents that would formalize transfer of responsibility from family to crown. "Miss Moonfall," Captain Aldrin said with professional courtesy, that balanced respect for her impending elevation with awareness of current circumstances that made elaborate protocol inappropriate. "His Majesty commands immediate departure for Royal Stronghold, where ceremony will proceed according to schedule that serves kingdom interests rather than personal convenience." "I'm prepared for departure," Elira replied with composure that surprised her, despite emotional chaos that threatened to overwhelm rational thinking about practical requirements that compliance would demand, regardless of personal feelings about arrangements she could neither refuse nor modify through appeal. "Excellent. Personal belongings should be limited to items of genuine sentimental value, as royal household provides all necessities according to standards that exceed private resources, while ensuring appropriate presentation that reflects royal dignity and status." The reminder emphasized thoroughness of transformation that would replace individual preferences with royal requirements, while providing luxuries that compensated for loss of personal autonomy through material comfort that most people could never afford, despite its inability to address emotional needs that such elevation might compromise. As final preparations proceeded with efficiency that transformed emotional farewell into administrative transition, Elira's family gathered for brief private moment that represented last opportunity for communication that would not be constrained by royal protocol and political considerations that governed interaction between subjects and elevated nobility whose obligations transcended family relationships. "Remember what we discussed about patience and adaptation," her father said, with voice that struggled to maintain strength while offering guidance that emphasized survival over happiness as primary objective for circumstances that offered no guarantee about ultimate outcome, despite formal advantages that royal status provided. "I will," she promised with commitment that encompassed both specific advice and broader obligation to survive circumstances that would test everything she had learned about resilience, accommodation, and maintaining dignity, despite conditions that might challenge fundamental assumptions about personal worth and individual rights. "And remember that we love you regardless of how circumstances change or what adaptation requires for your safety and welfare in an environment that operates according to rules we cannot fully understand or prepare you to navigate successfully," her mother added with emotion that emphasized permanent nature of family bond, despite physical separation and social elevation that would make future communing difficult, if not impossible. The farewell proceeded with restraint that acknowledged both love and necessity, while avoiding dramatic gestures that might complicate departure or create emotional scenes that served no practical purpose, except making compliance more difficult for everyone involved in arrangements that offered no alternatives acceptable to rational consideration. As carriage door closed behind her, and royal escort began journey toward Stronghold, where her marriage would formalize transformation from poor Omega into royal consort, Elira found herself observing countryside that gradually shifted from familiar terrain toward landscapes that spoke of wealth and power beyond anything her previous experience had prepared her to understand or appreciate. The roads improved dramatically as they traveled deeper into royal territory, while settlements grew larger and more prosperous, with evidence of protection and governance that provided security and opportunity that border regions could never maintain, despite similar efforts by local leadership, whose resources remained inadequate for comprehensive territorial development. "Captain Aldrin," she said, during rest stop that allowed brief conversation about journey and destination that would determine her immediate future. "What information about royal customs and expectations would help me avoid mistakes that might create problems during transition to court life?" "Royal protocol emphasizes respectful attention, appropriate deference, and careful observation until you understand preferences and requirements that govern daily routine," he replied, with professional guidance that balanced helpful information with awareness that specific details required direct instruction from royal household staff, whose responsibilities included orientation for new personnes. And regarding His Majesty's personal preferences and temperament that might affect how I should approach initial interactions and ongoing relationship development? His Majesty values competence, honesty, and practical results, rather than elaborate courtesy or emotional demonstration, Captain Aldrin answered with careful neutrality that avoided specific characterization while providing general framework for appropriate behavior. Direct communication serves better than elaborate protocol, though respect remains essential for all interaction. Does he typically show interest in personal welfare of household members? Or should I expect primarily formal relationship based on duty rather than personal consideration? His Majesty's approach to relationship management emphasizes consistency and fairness rather than emotional accommodation, though fairness includes attention to welfare that serves both individual needs and broader household efficiency. The diplomatic response avoided specific commitments about royal character while suggesting that practical consideration could be expected even if personal warmth remained uncertain, given reputation that emphasized efficiency over sentiment in all aspects of royal governance and household management. As journey continued toward destination that would reshape her entire existence through marriage that represented financial salvation for family and unknown future for individual, Elira found herself processing information and advice that painted picture of royal husband whose character remained largely mysterious, despite obvious power and authority that commanded respect throughout territorial sea. The cruel reputation that had worried her family might represent harsh justice rather than personal cruelty, while emotional distance that seemed to characterize royal behavior might protect rather than reject those who served household interests through competent performance of assigned responsibilities. But speculation about royal character provided limited comfort when approaching marriage, that would bind her to someone whose preferences and expectations remained unknown, despite their obvious importance for determining whether adaptation would lead to tolerable relationship or systematic suffering, disguised as elevation through circumstances that offered no retreat once ceremony formalized oblate. Negations that could not be escaped. The royal stronghold emerged from afternoon mist, like manifestation of power, that challenged comprehension through scale and grandeur, that spoke of resources and authority beyond anything individual imagination could encompass. Towers reached toward sky with architectural confidence that emphasized permanence and strength, while walls extended across landscape with defensive capability that could protect thousands of lives against enemies whose own power would seem insignificant compared to royal military and strategic resources. Impressive sight for first-time visitors. Captain Aldrin observed with obvious pride in royal achievements that his service helped to maintain and protect through loyalty that transcended individual compensation to embrace broader commitment to territorial stability and population welfare. "It's overwhelming," Elira admitted with honesty, that reflected genuine awe at evidence of civilization and power that exceeded everything she had been taught to expect about royal resources and governmental capability. Understandable reaction, though familiarity reduces overwhelming nature while revealing systematic organization that creates efficiency rather than mere display of wealth for its own sake. "Will I receive orientation about household organization and daily routines that would help me fulfill royal obligations without creating complications through ignorance about appropriate behavior?" Complete orientation beginning immediately upon arrival, with household staff providing detailed instruction about customs, expectations, and practical requirements that successful adaptation demands despite complexity that initially seems challenging. The promise of systematic preparation provided some comfort, despite recognition that formal instruction could not address emotional challenges that adjustment would create through proximity to someone whose character and preferences remained mysterious, despite their crucial importance for determining success or failure of marriage that served family necessity rather than personal compatibility. As royal escort approached stronghold gates that opened to admit them into courtyards, where activity suggested complex administrative operations supporting territorial governance on scale that required coordination between multiple departments and hundreds of personnel whose specialized functions contributed to overall efficiency, Elira realized that her new environment would challenge every assumption about social organization and individual significance that poverty had taught her to accept as natural limitations. The poor Omega who had survived through careful invisibility was about to become royal consort, whose visibility would make privacy impossible, while revealing whether adaptive capabilities developed through hardship would prove sufficient for thriving in circumstances that offered unprecedented opportunity, combined with equally unprecedented pressure to meet expectations that failure might make rouse rather than merely disappointing. Within hours, ceremony would bind her to king whose reputation emphasized power over mercy, efficiency over emotional consideration, results over personal accommodation, but whose actual character remained hidden behind political necessity and royal protocol that protected privacy while maintaining authority through careful distance from those whose proximity might create vulnerabilities that enemies could exploit. Looking toward Main Keep, where torchlight suggested ongoing activity, despite late hour, Elira wondered whether her marriage would reveal cruel husband who matched his reputation, or discover someone whose harshness protected rather than threatened those who earned consideration through competent service and respectful behavior toward authority that had been earned through methods she could not understand but might learn to appreciate. The carriage stopped before entrance that opened to admit royal bride whose transformation from poor Omega into elevated consort would begin with ceremony that formalized obligations while beginning relationship between strangers, whose compatibility would determine whether formal arrangement could evolve into partnership that served both individual welfare and broader political necessity that had created their union. Tomorrow would bring wedding ceremony that represented culmination of family salvation and beginning of personal journey toward unknown future that might offer happiness through successful adaptation or endurance through systematic accommodation to circumstances that would test every assumption about personal worth, individual autonomy, and the possibility of finding fulfillment within obligation. That had been imposed rather than chosen through mutual attraction and compatibility. The shy Omega was about to meet cruel Lycan King, whose love transcended lifetimes while remaining hidden behind necessity that made expression dangerous for both beloved and broader responsibilities that royal power demanded through prices that had never been fully paid, despite centuries of installment payments, through systematic heartbreak and eternal loneliness. The throne room stretched before her like cathedral of power, its vaulted ceiling disappearing into shadows that seemed to hold weight of centuries and authority that transcended individual understanding. Massive columns supported architecture that emphasized permanence and strength, while torchlight cast dancing patterns across stone walls carved with symbols whose meaning spoke of ancient oaths and eternal obligations that bound royal authority to cosmic laws governing power and its terrible prices. Lyra walked toward throne with escort, whose measured pace transformed her approach into ceremony that emphasized significance of moment, when poor Omega would formally bind herself to Lycan king, whose reputation cast shadows as deep as those that filled magnificent chamber around them. Her wedding gown, provided by royal household staff, felt like armor crafted from silk and precious stones, its weight reminding her with each step that transformation was already beginning despite ceremony that would make changes irreversible. King Vaelor Draven sat upon throne that commanded attention through presence rather than ornamentation, his bearing suggesting power that had been earned through experiences that mortal imagination could not encompass. Tall and powerfully built, with dark hair that caught torchlight and eyes that seemed to hold depths no living soul should possess, he represented authority that made approach feel like pilgrimage toward judgment rather than celebration of union between compatible partners. But as distance closed between them and ceremony prepared to begin, according to ancient customs, that bound royal marriages through sacred laws, transcending political convenience, Lyra became aware of something unexpected in royal bearing that challenged assumptions about cruel character that reputation had established. The king's attention focused upon her with intensity that suggested recognition rather than mere evaluation, while expression that should have remained neutral according to formal protocol carried emotions that seemed both profound and carefully controlled. "Your Majesty," she said, as escort delivered her to position before throne, where ceremony would proceed, according to Lycan traditions that emphasized permanent binding through sacred oaths, witnessed by powers that ensured compliance with obligations that could not be escaped through any subsequent change of heart or circumstance. "Elira Moonfall," he replied, with voice that carried resonance suggesting depths of experience and emotion that formal occasion should not have permitted to surface despite obvious effort to maintain appropriate royal detachment from personal feelings that might complicate political necessity driving their union. "I am prepared to fulfill marriage obligations according to your requirements and kingdom interests," she responded with formula that diplomatic instruction had provided for expressing acceptance, while avoiding specific commitments about personal feelings that honesty would not permit her to claim, despite recognition that survival would require successful adaptation to royal expectations. "Are you indeed?" King Vaelor asked with tone that suggested both doubt about her preparation for circumstances she could not understand, and something that might have been regret about necessity that had brought her to throne room for ceremony that would bind innocent Omega to fate that had already claimed too many victims through cosmic laws governing power and its prices. The question hung in air between them, while priests stepped forward to begin ceremony that would formalize union through sacred binding, that Lycan tradition invested with supernatural authority to ensure permanence despite personal feelings that might change through time or circumstance. But before ancient words could begin establishing mystical connection between bride and groom, King Vaelor raised hand that commanded immediate attention and silence throughout chamber filled with witnesses whose presence emphasized political significance of marriage that served kingdom interests. "Before we proceed with binding, that cannot be undone through any subsequent desire for different arrangements," the king said, with voice that carried both authority and something that might have been warning about consequences that ceremony would create. "You should understand that royal marriage involves obligations and dangers that your previous experience could not prepare you to comprehend or manage successfully. What specific dangers require understanding before ceremony proceeds?" Lyra asked with courage that surprised her despite recognition that questions might be interpreted as challenge to royal authority or criticism of arrangements that had been determined through necessity rather than mutual consultation about compatibility and shared objectives. "Dangers that extend beyond political complications or social adjustment difficulties to include cosmic laws governing royal power that demand prices from those who accept elevation through marriage to authority that was obtained through bargains whose terms remain binding across lifetimes and cycles of existence that mortal comprehension cannot encompass." The explanation suggested supernatural elements to royal authority that transformed marriage from political alliance into participation in cosmic drama, whose scope exceeded individual understanding, while potentially threatening survival through forces that operated according to laws beyond human control or negotiation. And what specific cosmic laws affect royal marriages in ways that create dangers for those who accept elevation through union with authority obtained through supernatural bargains? Laws that govern cycles of power, sacrifice, and renewal through eternal repetition that ensures stability for kingdom, while demanding systematic suffering from those who accept responsibility for maintaining cosmic balance through personal loss that serves broader welfare of populations who depend upon royal protection. As implications of supernatural obligations began penetrating her understanding of circumstances that had brought her to throne room for ceremony that would involve her in cosmic drama whose consequences extended beyond individual lifetime, Elira found herself confronting choice between retreat from unknown dangers and acceptance of fate that might serve purposes beyond her comprehension, while threatening everything she valued about personal autonomy and individual welfare. "Your Majesty," she said with decision that balanced caution with recognition, that alternatives to marriage remained unacceptable for family survival, despite personal risks that supernatural obligations might create. "What guarantees exist regarding my safety and welfare if ceremony proceeds despite cosmic complications that affect royal marriages?" "No guarantees exist," King Valor replied with honesty that emphasized dangerous nature of royal elevation, while demonstrating respect for her intelligence and courage through truth that diplomatic courtesy would normally conceal. "Royal marriage involves acceptance of fate that includes both ultimate fulfillment and complete destruction, depending upon choices made by powers that operate according to cosmic justice rather than individual preferences or desires. And if I choose to proceed despite absence of guarantees about personal safety and individual welfare in an environment governed by supernatural laws whose operation exceeds human control, then you accept fate that may lead to happiness beyond imagination, or suffering that transcends individual capacity for endurance, with outcome determined through cosmic laws that evaluate worthiness, through trials that test every assumption about personal strength and individual value." The warning provided opportunity for retreat, that honesty demanded, while emphasizing that advancement required courage to accept unknown consequences for decision that could not be reversed. Once ceremony established mystical connection between mortal Omega and authority that transcended individual lifetime through bargains whose prices had been accumulating across centuries of royal succession. "I accept such fate," Elira declared, with voice that carried conviction despite fear about consequences that rational consideration could not predict or prepare her to manage through any amount of careful planning or strategic accommodation to circumstances that operated according to supernatural rather than natural laws. "Then let ceremony proceed," King Valor commanded, with tone that carried both resignation about necessity and determination, to fulfill obligations that cosmic law demanded, despite personal costs that such fulfillment would create, through binding that connected innocent soul to fate that had already claimed too much suffering as payment for power that protected thousands of lives. As priest began ancient words that would establish mystical connection between bride and groom through sacred laws governing royal marriages, strange sensation began building in chamber that suggested presence of powers beyond human understanding, witnessing ceremony that would either fulfill cosmic requirements for renewal or trigger final cycle of curse that demanded ultimate sacrifice as payment. For defying fate's design. The binding proceeded through ritual, whose words seemed to resonate with forces that existed beyond immediate reality, while creating connection between souls that transcended individual lifetime, through cosmic laws that governed eternal cycles of power, love, and sacrifice, whose operation demanded prices that rational consideration could not accept despite spiritual necessity that such prices sear. When ceremony concluded with exchange of oaths that established permanent mystical connection between King Valor and Elira, according to sacred laws that bound royal marriages through supernatural authority, ensuring compliance with obligations that could not be escaped, transformation had begun, that would either lead to salvation through love that transcended cosmic limitations, or destruction there, or defiance of fate that had been carefully maintained through centuries of systematic sacrifice. 6 months later, the royal chambers had become familiar territory despite their luxury that still amazed Omega, who had grown up with poverty, that made basic survival daily challenge requiring constant attention to practical necessities that wealth eliminated through abundance. She was still learning to accept as normal part of royal existence, rather than temporary indulgence that would disappear out. And reality reasserted natural limitations. Elira's days had settled into routine that balanced royal obligations with personal time, that allowed gradual adaptation to circumstances that challenged every assumption about social organization and individual significance, while providing opportunities for growth and learning that poverty had never permitted through lack of resources and educational access. But despite material comfort that exceeded anything she had imagined possible, and household staff whose courtesy emphasized her elevated status rather than original humble circumstances, relationship with King Valor remained mysteriously distant, despite marriage that should have created intimacy through shared daily existence and mutual responsibilities for royal household management. He treated her with respect that bordered on reverence, providing everything she requested while maintaining emotional distance that seemed to protect both of them from connection that formal marriage should have encouraged through proximity and shared obligations. Their conversations remained politely formal, despite obvious intelligence and compatibility that could have supported deeper relationship if circumstances permitted such development. "Your Majesty," she said, during one of rare private moments when royal responsibilities allowed conversation without household staff or political advisors, whose presence made personal discussion impossible, despite obvious need for communication about relationship that seemed frozen in state of careful neutrality. "Have I failed to meet expectations or disappointed hopes you had for marriage partner? Urship, you have exceeded every expectation and fulfilled obligations with grace that honors both yourself and royal household," he replied with sincerity, that emphasized genuine appreciation for her adaptation and competence, while avoiding personal elements that might explain emotional distance that seemed to characterize their relationship, despite formal intimacy that marriage created. "Then why do you maintain such careful distance from interaction that marriage should encourage between partners who share daily existence and mutual responsibilities for royal household and kingdom welfare? Because closer interaction would create complications that could threaten both your safety and broader obligations that royal authority demands through cosmic laws governing power and its necessary sacrifices. What complications would personal intimacy create that could threaten safety or interfere with royal obligations that service requires through systematic attention to kingdom welfare rather than individual preference?" For first time since she had known him, King Valor's carefully maintained composure showed crack that revealed emotion and vulnerability that royal protocol normally concealed behind authority that seemed absolute despite personal cost that such authority apparently demanded from those who accepted responsibility for maintaining cosmic balance through individual sacrifice. Complications that involve curse-binding royal authority to cycles of death and renewal that demand ultimate sacrifice from those who claim love that transcends cosmic limitations imposed to ensure kingdom stability through prices that must be paid by royal house across generations and lifetimes. "Curse," Elira whispered with voice that carried horror at revelation, that transformed understanding of marriage from political alliance into participation in supernatural drama, whose scope exceeded individual comprehension, while explaining emotional distance that had seemed cruel but served protective purposes she could not have imagined. "Curse that binds me to eternal cycles of loving and losing the same soul across lifetimes, with final cycle approaching that will demand choice between claiming complete happiness and accepting complete destruction as payment for defying fate's design that requires systematic suffering as price for power that protects thousands of innocent lives." The explanation revealed truth about royal character that challenged every assumption about cruelty and emotional coldness, while exposing supernatural obligations that made personal happiness impossible, despite love that transcended individual lifetime, through cosmic connection that remembered what conscious mind had forgotten. "And I am that soul?" she asked with understanding that began penetrating conscious awareness, despite memories that had been suppressed, to protect her from knowledge too dangerous for mortal comprehension, while allowing natural personality to develop without supernatural influences that might compromise authentic individual development. "You are Elena reborn without memory of previous existences, while I remember everything, every lifetime where I loved you, every death that separated us, every renewal that brought hope, followed by inevitable loss that cosmic law demanded as payment for power that was claimed through pride rather than earned through wisdom. How many lifetimes have you loved and lost me through this curse? 17 lifetimes across 8 centuries, with 18th cycle now approaching conclusion that will either break curse through sacrifice that proves worthiness for redemption, or trigger final destruction that ends both suffering and protective power that maintains kingdom stability through royal authority derived from supernatural bargains. And what choice does final cycle demand that could either break curse or trigger destruction? Your choice between claiming you completely through love that transcends cosmic limitations, which would break curse but cost my life as final payment for redemption, or maintaining distance that preserves both kingdom protection and eternal separation that prevents happiness while ensuring continued existence to fulfill obligations that thousands of lives depend upon. The revelation transformed understanding of marriage from cruel arrangement into ultimate test of cosmic law that would determine whether love strong enough to transcend death could finally overcome fate's demand for eternal suffering as payment for power that had been obtained through bargains whose true prices had never been fully comprehended by those who accepted authority without understanding supernatural obligations that such acceptance created. As implications continued expanding through conversation that revealed truth about royal character and supernatural obligations governing their relationship, Lyra found herself confronting choice between safety that ignorance provided and participation in cosmic drama, whose outcome would affect not just personal happiness, but survival of kingdom that depended upon royal power derived from Bargai, and as that demanded systematic sacrifice as ongoing payment. Valor, she said with use of personal name that acknowledged intimacy their conversation had created, despite formal protocol that normally governed interaction between royal authority and elevated consort. What happens if we choose love despite cosmic consequences that such choice might create? Then I claim you completely through bond that transcends individual lifetime while accepting death as final payment for redemption that proves worthiness for cosmic forgiveness, with hope that curse breaks rather than transfers to another soul who would inherit obligation to protect kingdom through similar cycles of suffering and systematic sacrifice. And if we choose continued distance that protects you from cosmic consequences while preserving kingdom stability, then curse continues through eternal repetition that ensures kingdom protection while demanding systematic heartbreak as ongoing payment for power that serves broader welfare through individual suffering, that cosmic law considers appropriate price for authority that transcends mortal limitations. The choice would determine whether centuries of systematic suffering could finally end through sacrifice that proved cosmic worthiness, or continue through eternal cycles that protected thousands of innocent lives while demanding ultimate price from those who accepted responsibility for maintaining balance between power and cosmic justice. Looking into eyes that held memory of 17 lifetimes spent loving and losing her through supernatural obligations that made happiness impossible, despite connection that transcended individual existence, Lyra understood that her cruel husband's distance had protected rather than rejected her, while his love remained constant, despite cosmic laws that forbade its expression through prices too, arable for rational acceptance. The 18-year-old Omega, who had been sold into marriage to save family from poverty, had discovered that Lycan King's cruelty masked love beyond mortal comprehension, while cosmic curse that governed their relationship would finally face test that could either grant redemption through ultimate sacrifice, or condemn them both to destruction, through defiance of fate that demanded eternal suffering. G as payment for power that protected innocent lives. Then we choose love, Lyra declared with voice that carried conviction, despite fear about consequences that such choice would create through cosmic laws that operated according to justice rather than mercy. Because love that transcends lifetimes deserves freedom from curse that prevents happiness, while serving cosmic purposes that have extracted sufficient payment through centuries of systematic suffering, even knowing that such choice will cost my life, while offering no guarantee that curse breaks, rather than transfers to another soul who would inherit similar obligation? Especially knowing that, because courage to risk everything for love represents worthiness, that cosmic law should recognize as sufficient payment for redemption, that proves spiritual growth rather than continued punishment for mistakes that pride created centuries ago through ignorance about supernatural obligations. As decision crystallized between them that would either break ancient curse through sacrifice that demonstrated cosmic worthiness, or trigger final destruction that ended both suffering and protective authority that kingdom stability required, King Valor stepped closer with intention that had been suppressed through 18 lifetimes of systematic heartbreak and supernatural obligation. Then, let us claim what has been denied across centuries of separation, he whispered, with voice that carried love transcending individual existence, while accepting cosmic consequences that such claiming would demand through laws that required ultimate prices for ultimate happiness. Their kiss bridged gap between mortal existence and cosmic drama, while establishing connection that challenged fate's authority through love strong enough to transcend death itself. As supernatural energies began responding to defiance of cosmic law that had governed their relationship across lifetimes, chamber filled with light that suggested either redemption approaching or destruction, beginning through forces that operated according to justice rather than individual preference or desire. But beneath cosmic drama and supernatural consequences lay truth that 18-year-old Omega had discovered about cruel Lycan King, whose love had never wavered, despite curse that forbade its expression. Sometimes greatest cruelty comes from love that protects through distance, rather than love that destroys through claiming what cosmic law forbids, despite heart's demand for connection that transcends all rational limitation. The poor Omega forced into marriage had learned that her husband's cruelty masked devotion beyond mortal comprehension, while Lycan King, cursed to love same soul across lifetimes, had finally chosen happiness over duty, love over cosmic law, redemption through sacrifice over eternal suffering, that served purposes greater than individual desire for fulfillment, that fate had systematically denied the rough centuries of supernatural obligation. Whether their choice would break ancient curse or trigger final destruction remained for cosmic justice to determine through evaluation of worthiness that love demonstrated when accepting ultimate consequences rather than continued safety through systematic separation that preserved kingdom while destroying hearts that remembered connection, transcending individual existence and demanding expression, on despite terrible prices that such expression required through laws governing power and its eternal obligations. If you enjoyed this story, a like or comment really helps. And if you wish to hear more tales like this one, make sure you subscribe so you never miss the next tale.